El IICA le da la bienvenida a este evento y agradece su participación. Estas son algunas recomendaciones para mejorar la calidad de la videoconferencia. Habilite su micrófono solo en el momento que le den la palabra. Es importante mantenerlo en silencio cuando otra persona está hablando. Por favor, tener encendida la cámara en todo momento para que otras personas lo puedan ver. Si necesita atender algo personal, puede apagarla y encenderla al volver. Agradecemos por favor poner en silencio sus teléfonos celulares para evitar alguna interrupción en la videoconferencia. Recomendamos cuide su postura y su posición frente al computador. Para esta reunión contaremos con interpretación simultánea. Es muy importante que cuando ingrese al enlace de Zoom del idioma de su preferencia, debe hablar en ese idioma. Por ejemplo, si ingreso al enlace de español, debe hablar en español en todo momento. Al finalizar el video, les pedimos el favor de hacer silencio durante 30 segundos. Una vez finalizado ese tiempo, el moderador o conductor puede iniciar la reunión. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Jean-Charles Lavelle. I'm the country representative for ICA in Canada, based in Ottawa. Delighted to welcome all of you to this workshop. Very important topic. And we're using the momentum from the WTO Public Forum last week to grow on that, to press on this issue about trade and sustainability. You will see that it's a 2-hour workshop. So we've got a survey at the end, and it'll be about 15, 20 minutes, and we'll help you, we'll accompany you during the survey process. But for those of you who may not be able to join us at the end, we're going to be posting it in the chat in English and Spanish, so that every half hour you'll get a reminder about the survey that you can fill in yourself or participate in and share that in your networks. We much appreciate your involvement, engagement with this survey. We've got about an hour 15 of panelists and experts around the world to give you perspectives from the Americas on these very important topics. And for those of you just joining us, you can choose, we always get this question in the chat, you can choose your language. So you'll see there's an interpretation button in Zoom, sort of like center right. If you don't see it, go to 3 buttons, choose interpretation, and then choose English or Spanish. So welcome, everyone. Glad to have you. I'm going to go to Costa Rica now and invite our Deputy Director General, Lloyd Day, to give some opening remarks.
Well, thank you, JC, and good morning, everyone. I'm honored to have a few moments to speak with you about navigating sustainability in trade and agriculture from the perspective of the Americas. The issue of trade and sustainability is not exactly new, but it is taking a new form and starting to impose new barriers as well as presenting new opportunities every day. The term sustainability can both be very promising as a marketing label, but also controversial as different interest groups try to use it for their own purposes. A little less than 20 years ago, I became the administrator of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service, a vast agency which has as part of its responsibilities the definition of certain marketing standards that ideally are verifiable. This includes everything from marketing labels such as certified Angus beef or the organic label, to the quality grades of milk, eggs, beef, chicken, etc. These quality grades and marketing standards bring value and certainty to the marketplace when there exists required oversight and confidence that what you buy is what you get. During my tenure there, a group of organic certifiers attempted to create a national standard for sustainable agriculture that was very restrictive. And of course, they sought to define that standard with the ISO certification to avoid dealing with the Department of Agriculture. They also sought to ensure, as they did for the National Organic Standard, that the ISO standard would be inclusive of certain technologies, would not be inclusive of certain technologies, specifically of biotechnology. Well, as you might imagine, the U.S. agricultural industry cried foul, and I was asked to intervene in the matter given my role at the time. To make a long story short, we had quite a good food fight. But so far as I can tell, there is no ISO standard for sustainability, despite the plethora of labels you see in the marketplace stating that something is sustainable. I might add that the term natural is equally controversial and ubiquitous. I am mentioning this history for a specific purpose. That is to say that not everyone thinks the same way when it comes to defining what is or what is not sustainable. So to then insert the term into trade becomes controversial, as what someone thinks as sustainable in California, where I'm from, may not be the same as a farmer and rancher thinks about sustainability, for instance, in Alberta. And these are two regions of North America that are not so far apart geographically and culturally. Imagine when you try to define that standard for the whole world or insert sustainable production into trade rules at the WTO. For me, the best definition of sustainability for agriculture was enshrined into law in the US Farm Bill in 1990, which defined sustainability as satisfying human needs, enhancing environmental quality, the resource-based and ecosystem services, sustaining the economic viability of agriculture, and enhancing the quality of life for farmers, ranchers, forest managers, workers, and society as a whole. Since then, most have come to define sustainability as having three pillars: social, economic, and environmental. That seems clear and specific, but when it comes to international trade, it certainly is not. And let's face it, most only think about the environmental component. Last October, the Global Forum for Foreign Policy and Innovation, GIFPI, discussed the role of trade in agriculture and environmental sustainability. In a policy brief, it was noted that sustainability in agriculture cannot be approached with a one-size-fits-all mindset. Every region has unique production practices, scales, soils, cultures, landscapes, and environmental conditions. Therefore, trade policies should not be prescriptive and must recognize that food systems require local pathways adapted to local contexts, just like in Alberta or California. In a scenario of increasing changes in economic commercial relations, it is necessary to work collaboratively between different countries, but that is not so easy, as we all know, especially Doha. However, we also know that the challenge of climate change and the attempts by nation states to address their emissions and to produce sustainably is creeping into discussions of regulatory and trade policy. We live in a time when technological innovation in the agri-food sector may indeed provide the tools we need to both produce safe, nutritious, and accessible food for our citizens, while also tackling the challenges of climate change. But misaligned regulations are threatening this, as are initiatives to enshrine the views of one part of the world or the thinking of some on how to impose their views of sustainability on others. And this is where we run into trouble. Therefore, the work of all of us here who will be speaking later in this webinar is very important. In particular, I would like to applaud and thank the leadership of CAPI, the Canadian Agricultural Policy Institute, for providing intellectual leadership at the GIFPI and globally. At ICA, we have been working with member states in the private sector in this area for a number of years. In 2019, the Inter-American Board of Agriculture passed Resolution 520 on science-based trade measures. The ministers were reacting to a great deal of concern by member states about the EU policy of removing certain crop protection chemistries, reducing their MRLs to virtually a zero tolerance with no scientific basis. The EU started implementing this well before they even approved the Green Deal. A US-based firm, Bryant Christie, reported that the EU measures to restrict pesticides already approved as safe by the European Commission could impact 40 billion in agricultural exports from the Americas alone. Resolution 520 represented a ministerial commitment to affirm science-based policy for risk analysis as a process for assessing, managing, and communicating risk, while at the same time protecting public health and the trade of safe food and agricultural products. This was very significant. It represented a unity among agricultural ministers of the Americas, 34 countries in all, to stand up for science-based regulatory policy to govern trade. The Americas produce about a quarter of the world's food and export 1/3 of that food globally. 1/3 of all food exported globally. So the opinion from this hemisphere matters. Farmers need the tools that science brings them. And governments need to support that and regulate those tools for safety, not pull the rug out from under them once they have been approved as already safe. Meanwhile, also in 2019, the notion of transforming food systems started gaining traction. A group of NGOs, governments, and international organizations developed a narrative that the food system is broken for a variety of reasons, including health conditions, poor nutrition, carbon emissions, and persistent hunger. They hosted global meetings on the subject, but they did not invite any farmers or ranchers, nor any farm associations or ministers of agriculture, nor anybody from any of the major food distribution or food production companies. How can you talk about transforming the food systems without any of the participants in the actual system? So, in reaction to this broken food system narrative, and during a global pandemic, ICA started convening discussions with ministers and the private sector to both ensure that the food system was intact, but also to begin discussing a new narrative regarding food system transformation. In 2021, the Ministers of Agriculture of the Americas submitted 16 clear messages to the UN Food Systems Summit that were based on 3 fundamental principles. First, that farmers needed to be part of these discussions and need to be respected and supported. Second, that science, not political science or ideology, must be the foundation for public policy. And third, that agriculture must be viewed as part of the solution to the challenges of climate change. No other sector can both sequester carbon and reduce its emissions like agriculture. Moreover, agriculture is pivotal for transitioning from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that is renewable and regenerative, a bioeconomy. This bioeconomy includes everything from cleaner fuels to greener crop protection and fertilizers to the materials we use to live our life every day, such as bioplastics instead of fossil fuel-based plastics. As we've said in the past, as we have in the past, in the future, we will meet the challenge to produce enough food, feed, fiber, and energy for the world while reducing our impact on the environment. This will all be done by the convergence of myriad technologies and innovations if we are able to both approve and enable them while protecting human health and the environment. We have taken this message onward to the UN climate change meetings in Egypt, the UAE, and this fall in Azerbaijan. We are also continuing our policy work on science, ensuring that the Americas is well represented at global standard-setting bodies, like the WTO. I'm just returning from the scientific forum at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where atomic innovations may indeed not only provide us the tools we need to produce energy better, but also help us with a wide variety of innovations in soil, water, pest management, health, and food safety. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to regulating a world with diverse regions, topography, climates, growing conditions, and cultures. We need regulations that understand this and not try to ram a square peg into a round hole because one region or country may think in a certain way. This dialogue and many others are part of that process. We have taken this agenda recently to the WTO Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi, where we hosted a discussion on the subject with our member states and CropLife International. This month, along with ministers and ambassadors from the region, we continued this discussion at the WTO Public Forum and a discussion with key staff there, including Director General Ngozi, who had just called on the EU to rethink its deforestation regulation. CAPI had a standing room only event there. I was standing in the back. It was crowded. They needed a much bigger room as this issue is front and center at the WTO, and we need to make sure that we are present too. There's an old saying, if you're not at the table, you might be on the menu. And this presence is paying off. Just last July at the WTO General Council, after 6 years of work, the ministers endorsed key findings from the SPS committee, which acknowledged the relevance of science and innovation to sustainably increase production. And members agree that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to improving the sustainability of food and agricultural systems. Also last week in Brazil, global business leaders presented the recommendations of the B20 Sustainable Food Systems and Agricultural Task Force to the G20 agricultural ministers. They had three recommendations. First, foster sustainable growth through sustainable technologies. Second, build breakthrough models for financing food system transitions. And third, strengthen the multilateral system with the WTO at its core. Meanwhile, ICA recently convened for the first time a meeting of farm federations from across the Americas, from Canada in the north to Argentina in the south, where they achieved consensus on the importance of international trade as a determining factor in both transforming global food systems and achieving global food security. In the Declaration of San Jose, farmer leaders from across the Americas called on countries to embrace innovation and strengthen the multilateral system via the WTO and other international standard-setting bodies. We hope this leadership and political progress will benefit the productive systems from the Americas, but only time will tell. As we all know, trade redistributes food production, it provides a diversity of food choices, enhances price stabilization, combats hunger and malnutrition, enhances better food safety and health standards, boosts agricultural productivity, and allocates resources more efficiently. We all know this. It is fact, despite the chorus of anti-trade rhetoric that has become commonplace in our public discourse. We know better, and we know that trade, very importantly, will help, not hurt, the common goal of sustainability in each of its three pillars. We need to work together to change public perception and to base it on what is in the interest of all of our citizens, not just a narrow interest group. Events and discussions such as this provide important leadership and attention to this issue that is of local, national, and global importance. Thank you very much for your attention and best wishes for the discussions today. I look forward to listening and learning and participating as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lloyd. Excellent remarks. Really enjoyed them. I would add, the trade's contribution to food security and all these other benefits. We could go on. And for the audience, when Lloyd is speaking to MRLs and the broken food system narratives, we did a workshop on that about 10 days ago here in Canada. So the YouTube of the entire workshop is now available online. I'll ask my team to post it on the chat. Just to add to what Lloyd said on sustainability of the Americas, the peak population that, if you look at the Lancet and UN models, around 2067 may hit 10.5 of 11 billion, maybe. And the world is going to ask for more food from the Americas. That means we need to be smarter, more sustainable, and we are transitioning to a greener agriculture. Over the next 40 years will be the most important decades in the history of the world in agriculture to make sure we can feed 10.5, 11 billion people. By the end of the century, maybe 9.5. It'll go down after. So there'll be less pressure on the environment. But until then, in our lifetimes, because most of us will probably not be there by 2067, we've got a lot of work to do. And so you may notice I don't introduce the speakers. All the bios are available in the chat. Feel free to read up on the panelists. I'm going to invite now the next four panelists. The first one, we've got Doa Abdel Motal. She's a senior counselor at the WTO, part of the Agriculture and Commodities Division in Geneva. Over to you, Doa, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to IICA for organizing this webinar and this very important discussion on sustainability. I've been asked to present the state of agricultural trade. So I'll do that very briefly, and then I'd like to offer some comments myself on the issue of sustainability. At a macro level, I guess it's important for viewers to know that international agricultural trade has been growing steadily and that it's become very important. In fact, it has increased fivefold since the turn of the century. And approximately 25% of the food that is produced in the world today enters international trade. So that's very significant. And many countries around the world are completely dependent on international trade for their food security. The FAO has estimated that around 30 countries would face total starvation were they to be cut off from international trade in food. Whatever continent you look at, you can see this dependency. You can start with the Arab Gulf region, which is very dependent on food imports. Countries in the Arab Gulf import nearly 80% of their food needs. You move to Asia, you turn the globe around and you move to Asia and you find Singapore that imports 80% of its food. You move the globe around a bit more and then you find a country like Haiti in yet another part of the world that imports about 40% of its food. And even countries that don't import food, import the things that are needed to produce food. So Brazil imports about 85% of its fertilizer. That is to say that international trade is absolutely key. International trade in food is absolutely key. It's not a luxury, and we have an obligation, almost a moral obligation, to be sharing food. Now, the geography of global food trade has been changing, and it is moving towards South-South trade, which now accounts for a quarter of total agricultural trade flows. In fact, by 2030, Brazil is expected to surpass both the EU and the US as an agricultural exporter. China has become the world's largest net importer of agricultural products and food, together with India, Mexico, and Nigeria. Over the next decades, the largest demand for food is projected to come from Asia, followed by Africa. As the center of gravity of food trade moves towards the south and to the east, the composition of agricultural trade has also been evolving, largely due to urbanization and changing dietary patterns. The biggest rise we're seeing in food trade now is in processed foods. And it's important for viewers to know that processed food in particular today, is produced in global value chains. So the idea that your food is made in a particular country is only a very theoretical idea. Food like iPhones, like washing machines, like dishwashers, food is assembled across the globe. All you need to do is to look at a can of tomato paste to see the number of foreign ingredients that come into a single can that then gets assembled in a particular country and sold as made in that country. But it is no more than an assembly process. Now, international trade, this is sort of in terms of the macro picture. In terms of the micro picture in the more recent years, agricultural trade has had to respond to a number of different shocks: COVID, wars, multiple wars, but in particular the Russia-Ukraine war, which hit one of the world's most important breadbasket regions. What we have discovered about food and agricultural trade is that it is one of the most resilient sectors of world trade. Its resilience has come from, first, the demand inelasticity of food. People need to eat, whether there's war, whether there's a pandemic, people need food. But second, it has been resilient because the WTO has succeeded in constraining and in holding back some of the worst instincts of policymakers that we tend to see in times of crises, in particular in the food sector, where countries, as soon as there's a problem at the international level, begin to hoard food and to keep their food for themselves, building up food reserves, imposing export restrictions on food. And the WTO has been able to pull all of that back through, in particular, its 12th Ministerial Conference, where it urged countries to be very careful in their use of food export restrictions, and in particular to not restrict the export of food to the World Food Programme, impeding its humanitarian mission. So as a result of all of this, we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas at the aggregate sectorial level, agricultural trade fell by 5 to 10%. This was an impact that was 2 to 3 times smaller than the reduction in industrial goods. So agricultural trade remains strong, very strong during the COVID pandemic relative to industrial goods. Similarly, 2 years down the line from the Russia-Ukraine war, we see that markets have stabilized and that importers have found alternative sources for their food. And that's because of the very strong global supply chains and because the WTO has controlled the export restrictions, has rolled them back, and is also discussing the issue of food stocks. Having said that, world food prices, even though world food prices are now 2% lower than the same time last year and about 25% below their peak in March 2022 at the outset of the Ukraine war, progress is uneven. And there are still pockets of hunger around the globe and serious food price inflation in certain parts of the world due to exchange rate policies, other economic policies, conflicts, and so on. And of course, disruptions to food trade are still ongoing, and there are new wars that are erupting. So we can't be complacent. We need to continue to be opening markets. As I said, food trade is not a luxury, and we have to realize that the agricultural sector is, despite its resilience, is one of the most distorted sectors of world trade. Agricultural tariffs today are as high on average as industrial tariffs were in the 1950s. So that's to give you one order of magnitude. But subsidies in the agricultural sector are also extremely high, and they're second only to energy subsidies. So that's to give you another order of magnitude. So the WTO has a job to finish, which is the agricultural reform, agricultural trade reform. We must finish the job and we must make progress. On sustainability. Sustainability is a topic which in the WTO still has to find its pathway. There are tremendous fears in the WTO that sustainability will translate into new non-tariff barriers to trade. There's also a lot of fear that the term sustainability will lead to unilateral environmental policies and to their imposition on trade. So there is a reluctance, in particular amongst the developing world, to see sustainability come into the WTO. They worry that that may reduce some of the gains they've made in terms of their share of world trade. As Lloyd has explained so well and stated so eloquently, trade and food already contributes to a better allocation of natural resources, because whether it's an apple or a tomato or a cucumber, all of these foods embody land, water, and energy. So trade in food is trade in natural resources. And when we allow trade in food to happen, we are allocating natural resources in the most optimal manner around the globe. But going beyond just allowing trade to flourish to achieve sustainability, if we want to add more measures like carbon taxes and measures to do with deforestation and so on, we will need to exercise very good judgment and to have a very balanced approach. Currently in the WTO, and it doesn't give me a lot of pride to say this, but it's important to say it, a lot of the sustainability discussion is taking place in the context of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. It's not taking place in committees. A lot of sustainability issues have found their way to the dispute settlement mechanism, whether it's to do with the electric car, whether it's to do with solar panels, whether it's to do with palm oil and deforestation or renewable energy. All of these things now sit in the WTO dispute settlement mechanism before a panel of judges. We have to find a way to have a preemptive conversation about these things and to find a balanced approach that doesn't scare people off, that doesn't lead to unilateralism and to unnecessary barriers to trade. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
And on time too, Dora. Excellent. Well done. Wonderful context. I think it helps the audience really get a better grasp of the current realities, what's going on today, and some elements of the way forward too. So I want to work on that and invite Claire Citeau. She's working with us actually right now. She's also a fellow of the CAPI, and you heard Lloyd mention it earlier, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. and she's also part of the University of Ottawa, but she's working with us on the results of the survey, which we will publish in coming weeks. So we invite you to participate in the survey as a reminder, and then I'll ask Claire to go, share her presentation and share the floor.
Thank you very much. I think Paulina will put the presentation, and I see it's up already. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this discussion. My name is Claire Citeau. My presentation will cover the rise of sustainability in international trade and trade agreements. As mentioned, this is an area that represents an important shift in trade policy discussions lately, and it has implications on global agri-food. As a disclaimer, I'm not a trade lawyer, so consider this as a one-on-one crash course. Any views expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of any organizations. While I've made every effort to ensure accuracy, any errors and omissions are mine. Next slide, please. So the session, if you want to go to the next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. So the topics I'll cover will explore first the historical context of how sustainability considerations have evolved from aspirational language to enforceable commitments. We'll look at some of the drivers and implications for trade policy. We'll look briefly at some of the most recent developments in trade agreements, challenges, and possible future direction. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next, thank you. So starting with some historical context, the inclusion of sustainability provisions in trade agreements has its roots in the broader sustainable development movement that gained momentum in the late 20th century. The movement emerged from growing concerns about environmental degradation and social inequalities associated with rapid economic growth. The 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment marked a significant milestone, being the major first international gathering to address global environment issues. It led to the creation of the UN Environment Program and the groundwork on environmental diplomacy. There, the concepts of sustainability and sustainable development gained prominence in the 90s, largely due to the influential Brundtland Report, officially titled Our Common Future, which was published in 1987. The report, led by Gro Harlem Brundtland, defined sustainable development and emphasized the interconnectedness of environmental, economic, and social factors, defining sustainability and sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. It really sparked global discussions on sustainability, and in 1992, even led to the creation of Agenda 21, which was a global action plan for sustainable development that aimed at the time to achieve global sustainable development by the year 2000. A quick note about Gro Harlem Brundtland. She is a key figure in the history of sustainability. She served as the Prime Minister of Norway and was the first woman and youngest person to hold the position. She later became the DG of the World Health Organization and has been a UN Special Envoy on climate change since 2007, and is perhaps in large part a reason for why we're having this discussion today. So these developments on sustainability sparked growing awareness of the need to balance economic growth with environmental protection and social equity. It marked this shift in thinking gradually began to influence other spheres, including trade policy, as policymakers recognized the potential for trade agreements to either support or undermine sustainable development. In 1994, when the WTO organization was established, it acknowledged the importance of sustainable development in its founding document, the Marrakesh Agreement. While this agreement doesn't specifically focus on sustainability, we all know that the WTO is not an environmental agency. The preamble states that trade relations should be conducted while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. Next slide, please. And I'll go over this one quickly because both Lloyd actually has touched on those three pillars already. Here, while there are many definitions of sustainable agriculture, most incorporate the notion that true sustainability must balance economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Lloyd referred to the USDA definition of sustainable agriculture. If you look at the FAO website, you will see a slightly different version. Similarly, if you look at the UN Environment website, you will see a slightly different definition. What we see is that in general, sustainable agriculture is generally defined as farming that meets the needs of existing and future generations while also ensuring profitability, environment health, and social and economic equity. Again, the three pillars of sustainability. I will add, though, that in many of the forums, in many of the conversations, in the dialogues that exist on this topic, one of my observations is that often sustainable agriculture is often interpreted through an environmental lens. And there's actually studies that speak to this. And this is reportedly in part because the environmental lens is the most visible of the three pillars. Next slide, please. So the evolution of trade agreements and their relationship with sustainable policies can be described in three stages. Traditionally, trade agreements were seen as unlikely tools for promoting global sustainability, primarily focused on reducing trade barriers and facilitating economic exchanges, with sustainability considered mostly a domestic issue. So the main purpose of trade agreements was to reduce trade barriers and facilitate economic exchanges between countries. That's before the 90s. And they operated under the assumption that sustainability decisions were purely domestic matters, mainly targeting tariff quotas, limiting countries' ability to adopt regulations that might interfere with trade, even if those were to support sustainability objectives. We often refer here to the first generations of trade agreements. In the 90s, the rise of global environmental concerns led to a reconsideration of this relationship. While economic gains remain the main reason why trade agreements are of interest, they increasingly serve as mechanisms to secure commitments in various areas, including social and environmental domains. Perhaps in limited forms, early provisions focused primarily on side agreements and non-binding chapters. And we often refer here to the second generations of trade agreements, which expanded beyond tariffs to address non-tariff barriers, and also included provisions on services, IP, intellectual property rights, investment, and other barriers to trade, which are difficult to negotiate at the WTO. The third phase, the past decade, which is one that has seen a dramatic expansion in the scope and depth of sustainability provisions in trade agreements. Someone last week at the WTO public forum in our session referred to this new phase, this current phase, as the sustainability revolution. We increasingly see trade agreements, including obligations related to environmental conservation, labor standards, human rights, animal welfare, which really challenges the previous notion of regulatory neutrality in trade agreements. Those trade agreements are now known as deep trade agreements, and they use trade as a lever for sustainable developments. two main agreements that Canada is familiar with, both the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement and the one we have with some countries in the Indo-Pacific region, the CPTPP, actually feature dedicated chapters on trade and sustainable development with legally binding commitments. So what we see is increasingly agreements that include tailored mechanisms to enforce obligations, such as adjudication processes, trade restrictions, and specific compliance control measures. This also reflects a growing recognition that trade agreements can and should play a role in sustainability. Not the panacea, not the one main solution, but can certainly be part of the solution. Next slide, please. Here is an abstract from Ursula von der Leyen during her first mandate, what she stated on the role of trade and the sustainable development objectives that she saw as a result of some of the trade policy and her agenda for Europe. Here, the ambition is threefold. It's to really make trade policy consistent with the EU's environmental objectives, but it's also to disseminate sustainable norms and standards and export those around the world. And perhaps as well, encourage the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements of other countries. Sorry. Next slide, please. The evolution of sustainability commitments in trade agreements has seen, as mentioned, a shift from aspirational goals to enforceable obligations and more robust enforcement mechanisms. Initially, many viewed sustainability provisions in trade agreements with skepticism, considering them as political bargaining chips rather than meaningful commitments. Many even doubted whether states would use or enforce those provisions to drive behavioral changes. The NAFTA, the initial NAFTA agreement signed in 1994, included a side agreement on environmental cooperation, which was one of the first attempts to link environmental issues with trade, but its provisions were largely aspirational. In 2009, things started to change progressively. In 2009, the US-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement included an annex on forest sector governance, which contained specific enforceable obligations related to forest management and illegal logging. In 2017 was another important moment when the first dispute between the US and the United States and Guatemala concerning labor enforcement established a clear link between labor conditions and trade. It was a, sorry, let me just look at my, yes, when the first dispute panel, addressing a sustainability obligation, issued in this context a first report on a case between the US and Guatemala concerning labor law enforcement. The panel's approach required the complainant to prove a very strong connection between labor violations and bilateral trade, and this was seen as problematic and sparked attention and discussion. It really marked a turning point in the enforcement of sustainability provision. A similar case between the the EU and South Korea concluded that the link between labor standards and trade was inherently related to the trade conceived in the EU-Korea FTA. Most recently in North America with our customer agreement, which is a strong example of enforceable sustainability commitment, includes provisions for enhanced labor inspections, even a rapid response mechanism for labor violations, and strong environmental protections. All of this reflects a growing recognition of the importance of sustainability provision and a commitment to making them more enforceable. And this also signals a broader trend towards integrating quantifiable sustainability measures into global trade policies. While this process is complex and challenges, there is increasingly an acknowledgement that once sustainability impacts can be effectively quantified, somehow they should be incorporated into trade rules. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, the rise of sustainability has not happened overnight. Trade disputes have actually allowed countries to engage on the topic over the years. I heard last week a comment in Geneva at the public forum. Someone referred to it as a two-step forward, one-step back journey. A tuna case brought in 1991 was significant because it represented an early attempt to address sustainability issues, in this case, dolphin conservations, within the context of trade agreements. It was brought by Mexico and others against the US, and a dispute arose when the US embargoed tuna imports from Mexico due to fishing practices that resulted in high dolphin mortality rates. The panel ruled against the US embargo, citing two reasons: the product versus process issue. The panel determined that the US could not ban tuna imports based on how they were caught, but only on the quality or the content of the tuna itself. And second, the extraterritoriality principle. The panel ruled that rules did not allow one country to enforce its domestic laws in another country, even for environmental protection. This reasoning was largely based on concerns about potential protectionist abuses. If the US arguments were accepted, it could lead to countries banning imports simply because of differing environmental, health, or social policies. This ruling highlighted the tension between trade rules and environmental protection measures, and emphasizing the need for a balanced approach that does not undermine the predictability of the multilateral trading system. Shrimp. Another case was brought in the same context. Another case concerned a US policy that conditioned shrimp imports on the adoption of specific conservation measures by exporting countries to protect sea turtles. What's interesting here is that initially the panel ruled against the US, stating that such measures, regardless of their environmental purpose, posed a threat to the multilateral trading system. But the appellate body reversed this finding, marking a significant shift in WTO jurisprudence. It recognized that WTO agreements allow members to adopt certain policies that deviate from regular trade commitments, and acknowledge that such policies can be important and legitimate in character. It suggested that environmental measures could be compatible with WTO rules under certain conditions, and it signaled that the WTO system could accommodate environmental protection measures, provided that they meet certain criteria and are not applied in a discriminatory manner. I think this case represented a pivotal moment in the integration of sustainability concerns into the international trade framework, and demonstrated that environmental protection and trade rules are not necessarily incompatible, which perhaps paves the way for further developments in this area. Similarly, more recently, we've heard about conditions between the EU Free Trade Agreements and the EU Free Trade Association and Indonesia agreement that conditions tariff preferences on palm oil to sustainable harvesting. And same thing, the EU Mercosur Association agreement that links tariff preferences to the fulfillment of animal welfare standards. Next slide, please. You want to move to the next one, please? Oh, or I guess no, it's the two previous ones. Talks about complex interplay. Yeah, thank you. The interplay here between trade rules and environmental measures creates clearly ongoing tension in global commerce. And you've heard already about this. There is tension in multiple areas, tension between trade rules and sustainability measures, protections. There's tension between domestic policies and the multilateral context. And there's also tension between the pillars of sustainability themselves. If we look at the example of opening European markets to Brazilian beef, which could lead to more efficient resource use in Brazil, but it could also contribute to deforestation and increased greenhouse gas emissions. It could also lead to economic losses for European producers. This raises the question of whose sustainability is prioritized in trade agreements, the exporting country or the importing one. Similarly, developing countries may have different preferences with respect to environmental and social action compared to wealthy countries. Not everybody will want to prioritize the same sustainability pillars. Another challenge in global trade and agriculture that comes from this tension is that sustainability measures are often seen as trade barriers rather than enablers, again, creating further tension in policy making. The farmer protest in Europe last year highlighted this perception of complex trade-off between stringent climate commitments and increased market competition. This ultimately, I think, raises the question of how to shift the paradigm so that sustainability measures can be seen as creating opportunities rather than restricting trade. What are the effects? I think here we're looking more at the growing number and variety of sustainability provisions in trade agreements versus we're not necessarily looking at the outcomes, the impact they have on the world. For this, we would need to evaluate the significance of the commitments made and their actual implementation, rather than just the presence of sustainability commitments in texts. Some argue that there is no automatic or inherent link between trade and agri-food sustainability, as the impact of sustainability measures varies based on context, practices, and commodities. For example, coffee production in some region will lead to, as a result of increased global demand, has led to unsustainable intensification and deforestation in some parts of the world. But in others, it has incentivized the adoption of a certain shade-grown coffee practices that preserve biodiversity. There is also the view that while trade is not the panacea, it does play a critical role in enabling agriculture sustainability. Next slide, please. Trade policy tools can significantly impact agriculture sustainability through several key existing mechanisms. And I'll talk about three. The first one is the incorporation of environmental and labor chapters in trade agreements, as seen as recent trade negotiations in the US in particular. Trade agreements increasingly incorporate dedicated environmental and labor chapters with provisions aimed to ensure that trade liberalization does not compromise environmental protection or workers' rights. In agriculture specifically, this means setting standards for sustainable farming practices, prohibiting the relaxation of environmental laws to attract investment, and mandating compliance with core labor standards. Secondly, including agriculture sustainability principles in agreements such as WTO rules for trade distorting subsidies. And Doha spoke about some of this already. The WTO agreement on agriculture categorizes subsidies into green, amber, and blue boxes based on their trade distorting effects. And a third area of policy that impacts sustainability is the SPS measures and TBT measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade that can also influence agriculture sustainability beyond borders. These measures can set standards for food safety, plant animal health that promote sustainable practices, outcomes, and require traceability systems, for example, and can mandate labeling requirements. And I will add that the EU Farm to Fork strategy perhaps fit in that category, as it aims to reduce pesticide and antimicrobial use in agriculture, impacting its trading partners with various SPS requirements. Next slide, please. Here, what we have here is just a quick example of some of the provisions that have been incorporated into trade agreements related to sustainability, not necessarily agriculture. I'm not sure if you, perhaps the screen is too small to read them, but just to demonstrate that a number of provisions have been included in a number of trade agreements around the world. What I think is also important to recognize is something that we increasingly hear about. No one size fits all, and this was mentioned earlier. Every region has its unique production practices, scales, soils, cultures, landscapes, and the impact of sustainability measures in one place will have a different impact somewhere else. Next slide, please. Policymakers around the world, namely in the EU and the US, have increasingly started utilizing unilateral measures to pursue their own sustainability objectives. Brief examples: carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the EU deforestation free products regulation, US subsidies for renewable energy, and other regulations, for example, banning products made with forced or child labor. This proliferation of sustainability provisions in trade agreements has led to concerns about policy fragmentation and what is often referred to as a spaghetti bowl effect. The OECD has studied this and have published a report titled Fast and the Furious: The Rise of Environmental Impact Reporting in Food Systems, really highlighting the risk of creating a confusing landscape of different methodologies and reporting requirements that could lead to increased complexity, cost for businesses, in particular, those operating across multiple jurisdictions. Ultimately, the lack of a global trade policy framework for sustainable agriculture creates an unlevel playing field where differing standards and practices can lead to environmental degradation and hinder efforts to achieve global sustainability goals. As such, this lack of harmonization and fragmentation can create unintended consequences for producers in various parts of the world. As sustainability provisions become more and more common in trade agreements, there is a growing call for greater alignment and standardization to avoid creating some of these unnecessary barriers to trade. Next slide, please. I was pleased to hear you, Doha, earlier talk about the unfinished business. Yes, this intrigue at the WTO. This interaction between trade and the environment is not new, and the negotiators of the Uruguay round put sustainable development in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement. I hope, perhaps I'm too optimistic, but things appear to be slowly changing. At least there's a lot more discussion about that particular intersection of trade and sustainable agriculture. I did get the sense that the WTO and others are interested in addressing this intersection of trade and sustainability. The agreement on fisheries subsidies is actually one of the first, and perhaps you can correct me, Doa, but it's the first WTO agreement with strong environmental sustainability measures at its heart. The problem is that it took 20 years to conclude, and it's also taking some time for everyone to ratify it. But there's some positive developments that we are observing. A number of coalitions of member states are working on various issues such as climate, circular economy, plastic pollution, and so forth. And I will say, if you look at some of the proposals that have been proposed by members on that very question of the risk of global fragmentation the risk of fragmentation and the need to start new discussions at the WTO. I'm told that over the last 2 years, about 20 different proposals have been put forward by members, which I think is a sign that there is an increasing desire to use the convening power of the WTO to find some sort of commonalities in sustainability approaches, at least to avoid the unnecessary economic cost and to overall enhance sustainability policy efficiency. And last slide, please. Thank you. So I will say that overall, the research agenda investigating and looking at sustainability provisions in trade agreements has just begun. What is the path forward? I think has yet to be seen. This is work that includes multiple dimensions. One includes the why and the goals of sustainability provisions in trade. Not all countries are aligned on why there should be sustainability provisions in trade agreements, which sustainability should come first for market access, to level the playing field, to reduce barriers. One of the dimensions is about the how, what commitments and what mechanisms can we use to get there. Free trade agreements or sectoral agreements, perhaps a best approach. There's been also discussions about incorporating outcomes-based approaches to sustainability in trade. There's also been discussions about measuring sustainability outcomes and the difficulty of getting this when it comes to, sorry, I should have mentioned earlier, sectoral agreements. There's also important efforts led by the US and the EU in looking at adopting or encouraging the adoption of sustainable provisions. The US-led initiative, for example, in the Indo-Pacific aims to include dedicated chapters on this, which will ultimately or could impact agriculture practices and outcomes. So the motives and the drivers for this sustainability revolution are complex. The quest of nations today are not necessarily on how sustainability can be incorporated in trade policies, but also perhaps importantly on how we do this in the least trade restrictive way possible. The path forward is unknown, but I share here a picture of how I often view trade policy, a bridge that allows people and businesses to do their trade, enables the flow of goods and services and ideas and opportunities across borders, but a bridge that also requires pillars one that includes industry, one that includes informed negotiators, one that includes policymakers, and also the buying of the public and civil society that needs to support the need for more and better trade and essentially push the wind in the right direction. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Good preliminary overview of the rise of sustainability in trade. And I'd invite the audience to post their questions in the chat. Some of the panelists will be able to answer. We're slightly over time. And I know Valeria, our next panelist in Washington, D.C., has to move on. She has a hard stop. So I don't know how you want to proceed, Valeria. If you want to just stick to 2-3 core slides, we could share that presentation if you agree. If you're willing to stay on the full 15 minutes, it's entirely up to you.
Thank you, JT. I will. Don't worry about that. So let's start with this. So first of all, I will switch and change a little bit the tone here, and I will speak in Spanish. You gave me the option, so I will take it. Is that okay?
Always.
Perfect. Bueno.
Excellent. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to IICA and to CAPI for the invitation. For us, it's always an honor to be part of events like this. And when I was asked to talk about Latin America, that's why I decided to speak in the most common language in Latin America. I have a few slides.
Let me first say that I am speaking Spanish so that they get it. I guess I need to do that. Perfect. And I will share my screen. And you will need to confirm that you see the presentation. Is that okay?
We can, yes.
Perfect, thank you. So, volviendo entonces al español.
Okay, so going back to Spanish, thank you for the invitation. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Latin America, putting into perspective a little bit of the trade and the connection that we have between trade and sustainability. Lloyd spoke very well about it, and Claire said already a lot of what I was going to say, and so some of it is going to be repeated, but I'm going to try to skip those parts or spend the less time on those points. But going back to it, I might mention the same thing, but maybe with a different point of view, trying to capture what are the problems and conditions that we see in our region. Okay, so to get a little bit into the context of how we got started, or just to get started, I would like to point out here a slide where we are able to show numbers that come directly from the trade. What we see here is all the different regions around the world, but we look at them from the net exports, imports, and imports, exports, and the net trade balance. That's what I want to point out, where we're going to see very different things. There are many regions in the world that are, net exporters of agri-food, but are many that are net importers of agri-food as well. And so what I wanted to show with this line graph that you see on the right side of the slide is that out of all the regions, what we see is the behavior for Latin America and the Caribbean, which are the ones that have grown in terms of net trade balance. And the second one was the Oceania, but it's been growing less. And the next slide shows that although we consider Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole in the previous slide, it's a very heterogeneous region. And within the region itself, we have different countries that are net agri-food exporters, but there are some countries that are net importers. And what I would like to point out in this slide, it's the south cone of Latin America compared to trade, and how the south cone of South America has almost 25% more exports than the Andean region, which is the second region, sub-region in exports, which creates a lot of value in exports. Now, we spoke very well about trade. We already know what are the opportunities Latin America has to continue to grow the exports, but now we're gonna have a possibility of not just growing and selling. We also have to find a way to grow sustainably. And going back to sustainability, during my presentation, I'm going to use the same definition as Claire and Doyle mentioned before, which are the three pillars: economical, social, and environmental sustainability. So and now we see some different challenges and multiple objectives in which we have to consider to be able to have the right development and also the transformation of the sector, the agro food sector.
Me gustaría decir es, ya no es
So now you might say it's not enough to produce or grow more, but we also have other objectives of sustainability. And I would also like to point out that when we talk about sustainability, we're also talking about healthy diet. And within a more healthy diet, we also have to take into consideration the concept of diet.
ciertos
So it's not only eating certain products, but also how the diversity of a diet includes other positive factors. And also, the, we also need to have the vision of the system, right? The agro-food system. And and we're going to have new demands and new dimensions, of course. So then we have the concept of food security, how we're going to be able to get that food security. But that food security, going back to it, it's nothing more than food security, the amount of calorie intake, but we also have to include the environmental aspect of it, how those calories are being produced, considering environmental conditions, matters of health, nutrition, and of course, inclusivity, and all the other areas that come from the economic sustainability. Now,
para esto entonces tenemos varios factores.
for this, we take into consideration different factors and trends. I already mentioned some of the differences that are within our region. Some countries, especially and within the Caribbean and Central America, some are net importers of agri-food, while others, especially in South America, have a production level that is way above their own consumption. There's also concerns about the food security and the climate change and how is this going to influence the political and environment, which means that this has to be included in trade policies that we have discussed within this event. So now some of the drivers, here we have the population growth, the higher income. It's also going to have an effect. We are not only going to be able to consume more amounts, but more protein, more fruit, more vegetables. And also the other is that there are many techniques or technologies for innovative production, but what we are missing here is the environment, the enabling environment for these policies, institutions, and also the financial and economic one, so that we can have not only the adoption, but also an adoption to a scale that is necessary to be able to have the impact that we want to accomplish. And then we have several disruptors in which Latin America has been impacted. We are also going to mention several challenges, the most important one being climate change and the fragmentation, the geopolitical fragmentation in which we are going through. In climate change, what we're going to see is basically here. Wait, let me go back here. Okay, and so climate change, what it's going to provide is more or less a change in the precipitation time is going to have an impact on the yield of our growth, our production. And this is also going to have an impact in the trade. It's going to change the comparative advantages, not only between countries, but within the country itself as well. So we're going to be able to have we're going to have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared in having the right technologies, in having that surrounding where we're going to be able to capture that necessary investment. And the other component, going back on that, that we also see, and that is something that we have to pay a lot of attention to, and with this in mind, it's the total productivity of the factors. How in the past few years we have seen leveling or a plateau. Globally, we continue to have growth from the PSB, right? And the total production of the factors, but when we see by region, it takes us back to the different trajectories that each region has. Like, for example, we see countries in Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa mostly, and they have had a very little growth, less than 1%. The developed countries and the other side have been able to stagnate or stay stable, and then we have the countries on the global fact we have differences. China and Brazil have kept a very high growth on the TSP in the past few decades. India has had yield that has been amazing in the past 15 years, but comparably Latin America, although it has had a relatively high growth in the decade of the 90s and the 2000s, it had stagnated once again compared to the previous numbers. And these are numbers from Puglier. And so the question that was also mentioned by Doa is then how can trade comply with the role not only on where are we going to produce in terms of how we're going to keep this environmental sustainability that we need, but also what is the need aside from the countries, the trade, to be able to capture everything that are to be consumed for those products that don't have enough domestic production. And this is on the image on the left that has more green areas. This is the trade of protein products, and we see those that are purple are the ones that really need imports to be able to have the right level of protein availability for domestic consumption, while the graph on the right, the map on the right that has red areas, what shows is the number of food groups that are. We have 9 different food groups. We have animal origin, dairy, and we have starch, nuts, sugars, oils, and in which the local production is not enough to be able to maintain the healthy diet that that country has. And so the countries that are darker red are countries that have not enough, a higher level of the scarcity of those food groups. And if we see Argentina is in a very light red, means that they are almost self-sufficient to be able to keep the supply of the 9 food groups, while a country like Venezuela, which shows very red, or Madagascar, it looks very red, and it's the contrary. And so, what do we have a problem at a global level, right? In some way or another, we have to, if we're looking at environmental things, it's global issue. What affects one country affects the others. And regarding trade, we need to find ways to improve the food security worldwide and in each of the countries as well. So we need joint global actions, given climate change and food security. And these two are completely interconnected, like we heard before. And we're going to need a global approach to be able to improve our efficiency and reduce this negative impact. We're also going to need technologies and efficiency promoting this type of agricultural activity and looking into this productivity from the point of view of green productivity. So taking into consideration the environmental conditions or other external factors, as they're also called. And also we have to look into the role of trade, like Doa mentioned already, that today over 20% of global calorie consumption comes from traded products, so that they have to cross some border at some point. And it's probable that this number is going to grow in time. Now, let me point out one a specific point regarding certifications and environmental standards. And this slide is based on a chapter that was written down by Xavier Patendier and Brian McNamara in a book that we recently published. It's a book on ISPRICOM with IFPRI and ICA as well, and we published in the public forum of the WTO in last week in Geneva. And going back to it, this is only one of the chapters in the entire book, and this chapter explores the intersection between trade and sustainable development, looking in particular the voluntarily sustainability standards. These voluntary standards, the advantage they have, and it was also mentioned before in the previous presentation, so they can facilitate trade or access to a market and improve the brand reputation and the trust by the consumer. The problem that it has certain challenges. one of the main challenges is the implementation, which then would require a modernizing of the standards that would require a little bit of increase on the transparency of what does this certification mean and how does it work, and then the creation of monetary incentives that can maintain and keep it in the culture. One of the main items that is point out, it's the challenge that we have in terms of the gap or the lack of a global governance on the issue, and how the WTO and the World Trade Organization has to take that role and take it and start developing something with some sort of recognition and evaluation of the conformities and the compliance, looking into the labeling or branding and the inclusiveness of the standards, as well as analyzing and considering some other incentives that are mostly related to trade, like will be, barrier or tax deductions that will be applied for these products. And the other point that I would like to point out is on the previous slide, we were talking about certifications and standards that although have been developed in the private sector, they have an advantage of being considered from a multilateral approach. And that's why it's so important for the WTO to really take ownership of that and an active role. So I would like to point out in this slide the contrary, the other part of the other side of the coin. What happens if in absence, if we all coordinate an action plans towards the future in matters of sustainability? And one of these cases is what will happen with the new regulations of the European Union with regards to deforestation, which is a unilateral measure. And what we would see from the Latin American point of view is how Latin America is going to be completely affected and a big impact once we implement these regulations, because we see the great amount of exports coming out of Latin America, the destined to the European Union, and they are products that are included in these new regulations, such as livestock, cocoa bean, the soybean, the palm oil, the coffee, as well as the rubber. But yeah, these are some of the things that we definitely have to take into consideration and consider what to do in the future. And to wrap up here, I would like to leave you with some final comments to consider on how to move the sustainability agenda in a feasible way within our region. And for this, obviously, we're gonna need to be prepared to answer to the shockwave, and this shockwave is gonna be related with climate mostly, and due to climate change. We're gonna have greater changes, more abrupt changes, and also the frequency is gonna be more constant. But also, we have to include not only the part of conflict that happen in other parts of the world right now, but also the new geopolicies in which we are now involved, and that Doa also mentioned a little bit during her presentation. Now, so this means that we're going to have to be better prepared to respond to these shockwaves, and we're going to have to invest and develop, and we need to create the necessary environment for the adoption of climately smart technologies. We're going to need to continue to still have expenditure in research and investigation that supports these new technologies. And like I said before, we need to look into the need to maintain our fiscal balance and the right environment so that we can generate and we can attract a green investment into a region. And the last thing I see is to keep an active trade agenda, open trade agenda, and to promote the multilateral scheme. And I thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And if you need anything, I will be here to answer any question by email. Thank you very much.
Y también por el chat. Gracias, Valeria. Excelente.
And thank you, that was great. And I would like to add, since this is Latin America and the Caribbean and talking about the Americas, you need to include Canada and the United States, right? And within all of these agreements and opportunities such as nearshoring, friendshoring. And yes, after COVID, we realized, yes, that also what happened with the invasion from Russia to Ukraine. So I'm going to switch to English.
So I wanted to also just comment quickly. COVID allowed us to see that the food industry, the food trade was affected by the closing of the borders in many places and the behaviors of trade policy and decisions around the investment in productivity over many decades at the expense of resilience. And many vulnerabilities were exposed, and then we couldn't feed the world the same way. There was greater food insecurity in the world during COVID, and it's still higher in many places, including the Caribbean right now. And in the news this morning, the entire discussion on the national radio show was on the drought in Brazil and how the global coffee prices are going to go up around the world. So, trade it's the most important beverage in Canada, but we don't produce it. So anyway, excellent. Food security is paramount. Can never lose sight of that. Please add your questions in the chat. The panelists are happy to answer them during the conversation with you. I'm going to suggest after Tyler, we have maybe 5 minutes of debate among the panelists. If there are any questions, we should answer them, and then we'll move to the survey. So I'm going to move to Ottawa. Safe travels, Beredia. And invite Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, to go next.
Thank you very much, JC, and I will try and make my remarks tighter this morning to give us more time and space for some of that debate that you just talked about in that discussion. First, let me just start by saying I think that the panelists that have spoke before me really have covered a lot of really important ground, and I want to offer my wholehearted support for most of what they've said and the points that they've covered. What I want to do with the time that I have is offer my perspective on where sustainable trade is at in the Canadian context, and offering what I refer to as a Canadian's perspective rather than a Canadian perspective on sustainable trade, recognizing that within the country, and we really have an evolving approach and sense of what sustainable trade and agriculture and food products means today. I'll speak to some of what that evolution looks like in practice, but we are all in the space where we're learning and evolving together. So with that, let me walk through this presentation and acknowledge that I think for many people today, there's still a question around whether or not trade and sustainability is an intersection that's smooth, where they go together and move along, or it's a collision where they will come together and collide in a more fractious way. Certainly, when we hear about the deforestation regulations, when we hear about carbon border adjustments and their potential, when we look at this already exploding pressures around non-tariff barriers, there's a lot of concern that it will be more collision than smooth intersection. But there's a tremendous opportunity, and we think that there's an opportunity for Canada in particular, and working with IECA and other partners in the Americas to really show leadership on this file. And I go back to something that one of our past board members, who spent most of his life negotiating trade agreements, wrote several years ago that highlights, we are in this very difficult, challenging world, and we are in a time of a need of new solutions and new ways of thinking and new ways of doing business. And there really is an opportunity for Canada to show leadership, to really try and find ways to look at how do we remove the remaining impediments to agriculture trade, but also at the same time ensuring that those efforts to free trade result in more trade and environmentally sustainable products. And so a lot of our thinking about sustainable trade in the Canadian context thinks about what opportunities there are for Canada, for the Canadian government, for Canadian stakeholders, for Canadian farmers, for others, to work with partners to show that leadership to develop these new solutions. I really do think much of the context around sustainable trade needs to be grounded in this reality that when you look at the top of this slide and look at food production, most of food production today is happening and is being produced in Asia, but most of food trade today is coming out of the Americas and to a certain extent Eastern Europe, and moving into East Asia and to other parts of the world. We really have a big difference between who are the major producers and who are the major importers and the major exporters. And we have the significant difference between the dynamics around sustainable food production, which is really an effort that we all must work together on, and is something that we all should be in together, and sustainable food trade, where we've got a very different a large differences between the parts of the world that are responsible for the export side of that sustainable trade equation and the import side of that sustainable trade equation. And I think that highlights many of the tensions that are at play here around production versus the export equation. And it's important to recognize when you look around the world that not all food is equal. So what I've tried to do is look at two graphs. One looks at GHG emissions for feedstocks in biodiesel markets. One looks at GHG emissions in beef, and without getting into necessarily the specifics of the numbers, I think what it's important to try and highlight is that there is a huge variation in the footprint from a climate perspective, from a carbon emission perspective, in the products that we consume, depending on where they are, depending on how they're produced. And this doesn't take into account the differences in pressures on land use, the differences in pressure on water, and other elements around food production. And it also doesn't take into account the differences in between what drives these impacts from a management production decision framework versus what reflects the natural advantages or disadvantages that we all have. One of the benefits of Canadian cropping systems is that we have winter. And the reality is that winter, that break in our cropping system, gives us some natural advantages. We have in Western Canada significant natural grassland ecosystems. Producing beef on those natural grassland ecosystems gives us a comparative advantage from a emissions perspective. So how do you understand, how that difference in food and in food's footprint looks when some of these measures are just where we are farming and where we are producing the food, compared to the differences in how we farm that food and the different efforts and approaches that we take. But as was already touched on earlier, the reality is that we are in this world of increasing trade. We are in a world of fewer exporters and an increasing number of importers, and that's going to have an impact on how we think about trade and how we think about trade and food production and how we think about sustainable trade and whether or not food is moving from regions where it is produced sustainably to where it can be consumed sustainably and how that takes everything into account. But ultimately, when all of this comes together, I'm going to use a hockey analogy from my Canadian perspective on sustainable trade, because when you look at a hockey arena, when you're in your end of the ice, when you've got your players there and you're in front of your goalie, this gets to be a defensive issue, right? You're trying to keep the other team out. You're trying to keep the puck out of your own net. But at the other end of the ice, you play offense, and your goal is to get the puck in their net at the end of the day. And I think we have a hard time understanding today on sustainable trade. Are we as a country playing defense? Are we as a country playing offense? Are we stuck in the middle in a neutral zone and in a scrimmage as we try and figure out where do we go next and what do we do about it? And I think a lot of the opportunity comes from recognizing that it can be an offensive interest. We can play offense in this in a Canadian perspective, and recognize that can be a good thing for Canadian agriculture, for the Canadian government, but also a good thing for global food security, global environmental outcomes, global economic outcomes. But much of, I think, the context that we all think about in Canada today really comes down to where are we on the ice and how do we think about it and how do we play this at the game at the end of the day. A quick overview on ag sustainability policy in Canada, just to say that we really have been on a journey over the last couple of years. This is a graphic that came out of a report produced by our Auditor General's office that told the story that looked at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's climate change mitigation programs. But what we really have seen is an increase in the focus and the efforts and investments around agriculture and its environmental footprint, recognizing that Canadian farmers have been on this journey for as long as they've been farming. What we're seeing now is the policy environment, I think, really starting to try and catch up. But we recognize, and the Auditor General's report speaks to the challenges of doing that and doing that effectively and doing that in a meaningful way. One of the things that the Canadian agriculture ecosystem has done, the stakeholder community has done, is come together around a national index on agri-food performance. And it is intended to be a way to offer transparency and accountability on how Canadian agriculture and food is doing on sustainability. Recognizing, Claire talked earlier about the three-legged stool. In this case, we talk about environmental, economic, food integrity, and societal well-being. It's important to understand that this is a collaborative effort where we've got farmers and processors and civil society groups and governments and academia and many more sitting together around a table. There's 150 plus partners today that are engaged in this process, but it comes from this real recognition that when we think about the sustainable agriculture landscape, we need to think about how all of this fits together. We need to think about what does credible data look like, and we need to, where possible, be talking the same language and be talking from the same perspectives. And in a system as complex as the food system is, that can at hard time be troubled. Part of what we're working through now is how do we leverage initiatives like this Agri-Food Sustainability Index as a tool for sustainable trade and for advancing sustainable trade solutions. But the index itself speaks to some of the challenges around sustainability. We've got a situation now where we're looking at 4 sustainability blocks, 20 indicators, and over 130 metrics that were agreed to as what's needed to think about the whole context of food system sustainability in agriculture, in food in Canada. What that does is highlight how complex this is. All of the metrics that were identified don't have full data available for them. A big part of the exercise was acknowledging that there are big data gaps that exist today. But understanding that, you know, when we think about this in the domestic context, we've got this very complex map and web of indicators that work together or that should be taken into account together. How you translate that into a meaningful trade enabling solution is something that we all need to work through and we need to think through at the end of the day. The stakeholder community in Canada is evolving how it thinks about this. CAFTA, which is our association of export-focused industries, just released this summer a set of principles for sustainable and free agriculture trade. The principles are theirs. The highlighting, the bolding is mine. Just to kind of draw out some of the key themes that are here. You know, it needs to be about productivity growth. It should look at food security, the important role that it plays. WTO disciplines that were talked about earlier need to underpin the system so that sustainable trade looks at being an enabling tool and not a trade barrier itself. We need to find ways to address that natural comparative advantage that I talked about earlier. And ultimately, it should foster cooperation and engagement, recognizing that there is going to be no one-size-fits-all approach at the end of the day. And again, I think a lot of the themes that are here in these principles advanced by CAFTA are reflected in work done by other groups, including the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and reflect many of the things that Lloyd and other panelists would have heard as they've gone around the world and increased the dialogue and engagement on these topics. I'd like to spend the last little bit of time talking about the Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation. Appreciate the work that Lloyd and Aika have done. Lloyd joined us in our workshop in July 2024. Claire Citeau has held the pens on the reports that we have published coming out of this, and we appreciate the engagement that we've had around the world. GIFPI is was founded by CAPI, our counterparts in Australia, the US, and in Brussels, but really is intended to be a platform that encourages broader engagement around the world. We have held 2 events, one in Paris in 2023 and one in Washington in 2024. You know, the outcomes of the Paris workshop that Lloyd talked about earlier were reflected in a report that Lloyd referenced. Really, these are not going to be earth-shattering conclusions, but are really important ways to ground the debate. You know, we need to look at how do we enhance food systems and trade through outcomes-based approaches to sustainability. How do you look at intensifying global cooperation in support of coherent policies in a global framework? This can't just be done individually by countries around the world. We need to look at how do we optimize trade to make agriculture sustainable and profitable, and how do we harness data and technology to transform the way that we grow and trade food. You know, these were conclusions coming out of our one-day workshop with representatives, stakeholders from around the world. But one of the big conclusions that came out of it is, while these are very simple, high-level outcomes, the devil really is the detail. And how do we take these and operationalize these conclusions, these outcomes is a challenge. What we did try and do is really identify where do we need to do more to explore these themes and develop and put some more meat on the bone, so to speak. But ultimately, you know, I think we've really latched on to things like, what do outcomes-based approaches mean? How do you advance them and deliver them as a really important area that needs to be explored and gone further. So we did do that in our second workshop in Washington, where we looked at measurement and outcomes. And I think as we get into more details, we get into more of the tensions that exist here. What are those tensions between the economic, social, and environmental pillars? How do you reconcile the different pressures around trade and environment? How do you look at solutions that are trade enablers rather than trade barriers at the end of the day? And it is hard. We do see these solutions that are there on the table, but there are pros and cons to each of the solutions. There are different perspectives around how those solutions should be advanced. But when we think about this roadmap to action and steps that could be taken, it really is about how do we adopt a principles-based approach to sustainability that's really grounded in outcomes? How do we undertake the necessary actions and investments to improve our measurement and data management? How do we create systems for international cooperation? Again, I think I want to really acknowledge the good work that IECA is doing, trying to lead that international cooperative effort. How do we reframe sustainability in a way that recognizes that it is a positive and essential element to the future of the food system, recognizing that innovation and technology play a really critical role in advancing and improving our footprint. And going back to something that Lloyd really talked about at the beginning, how do we do a better job engaging farmers in policy development, recognizing that they really are on the front lines of the efforts to improve policy development? And we need to understand, again, the different contexts that they operate in and the potential impacts that sustainability rules can have on farmers, big and small, around the world. So let me just wrap up by saying that, again, I think when we look back around whether or not this will be an intersection or a collision, it is certainly a wicked problem that we all need to come together to solve. And I think that the best way that we can do this at the end of the day is through collaboration and cooperation, and look forward to talking to everyone more. Back over to you, JC.
Fantastic, Tyler. Really enjoyed that. And I'm thinking our colleagues in the Americas, I'm going to suggest that they use a soccer pitch in their presentations from Mexico to Argentina, and maybe cricket in South Asia and elsewhere. But that was very good. I really, it was a good refresher for me and a good Canadian perspective. I wanted, since you ended with mentioning Lloyd, I'd like to invite maybe the panelists, and if they can open their screens, and we can have a quick debate. What you've heard, maybe Lloyd or Doa would like to respond to Claire's talk or Tyler's talk, or maybe Tyler right away, you have a question for Doa. Like, it's entirely open for, I'd like to open it for 5 minutes, and after that, we will move to the survey. And with the last 15 minutes, we will help the audience complete the survey question by question. Just raise your hand or just open the mic. No, it's like a coffee room. Just speak up. Feel free. Or Claire, did you want to ask or comment on what you've heard so far? They can hear you. It's not wrong.
Perhaps I have a question for Doa on how regional agreements.
JC, I'm sorry, I can't hear you with the pouring rain here in Costa Rica. I can't tell if you're asking me to talk or not.
Go ahead,
Because
Lloyd.
the
We're
rain
fixing a mute
has just
issue.
gotten so loud I can't hear anything. So I'll just put it on mute. You guys continue, and maybe when things the rain passes, I can say something.
All right, then, no worries.
Yes, the question is for Doha, and it's on how regional agreements, so while the WTO is still debating this whole question of trade policy and sustainability, whether the WTO is also looking at models that perhaps have been established under regional agreements, and lessons learned, there to take into consideration.
Thank you for that question. I think that the WTO wants to promote multilateral trade. Regional agreements are fine insofar as they represent a step further, insofar as they represent deeper integration. What we see in agriculture and in regional agreements is that while they may deliver market access, what they don't deliver is a reduction of subsidies. So with domestic support being one of the most difficult issues in agriculture, regional agreements don't take us very far. There are no bilateral or regional agreements that have cut ag subsidies. And so the WTO remains a very important forum, but can we make headway on subsidies? And that's a very difficult issue. And in fact, at the seminar that Valeria and I participated in yesterday at IFPRI, we spoke at length about this issue. Subsidies negotiations in the WTO on agriculture are complicated for a variety of different reasons. One is that developing countries feel that there's historical inequity in how the agreement on agriculture was built, giving more policy space on subsidies to the developed world than to the developing. There's also, there are some countries who would like to see a sequencing between the market access pillar and the domestic support pillar. They want market access in return for domestic support, so they don't want domestic support to move on its own. And then finally, there's a bigger conversation in the WTO now taking place on industrial subsidies, and it's getting linked to ag subsidies. Industrial subsidies are a problem that is now under the microscope, with countries like the US saying that the WTO subsidies agreement is not succeeding in catching Chinese industrial subsidies. And so some would say that there's a trade-off now to be found between agricultural and industrial subsidies. So that's a sort of a response to your question, but I'd like to comment more generally on the sustainability issues that have been raised by various presenters and by Tyler. I think that sustainability is not a problem until you begin to impose production method criteria on a trading partner. Then it starts to become a problem. So sustainability is not, if a country is looking for sustainability within its own confines, it is absolutely free to do so, and and that doesn't create a problem for trade. And if it wants to export products that meet certain sustainability standards that it has determined, that creates no problem for international trade either. The issue becomes when a country wants to impose its vision of sustainability on a trading partner and on how they produce the goods that they sell. So it's not about the apple or the tomato that is crossing a border, or the can of tomato or the chocolate bar. It's about how you produce these things before you sold the chocolate bar or the can of tomatoes. And that becomes it's a very complicated subject, and will always remain a complicated subject, and not just on the environment, but on any kind of standard, whether it's human rights or labor or any other issue. And what would be very helpful, and I think, and what would break the log jam would be international standards. I mean, if there was a universally recognized way of accounting for carbon, maybe things could move forward. But given that there isn't, and given that to begin to go in that direction, countries are resorting to unilateral approaches where they are imposing their vision, things are getting tricky and understandable. That's just more food for thought.
But if I could take the opportunity to take it almost back though to the subsidies question, because I do think that that the question around standards and measurement and trade is only one part of the sustainable trade equation. I think as we see increased investments around improving sustainability outcomes, we see that as a potentially a greater competitiveness issue. I think in the Canadian context, we always look south of the border to see what the Americans are doing and what incentives their governments are offering farmers. And it does seem that this has become a very much a bipartisan effort, that we should support farmers more for conservation efforts in ways that may have that impact. I just note that I think that the green box has often been one of those areas where there has been broad agreement, and I do wonder whether or not there needs to be more consideration around what does that actually mean and look like today in a context where sustainability is increasingly the vehicle being used to drive support and investment for farmers around the world, and what impact does that have on competitiveness and trade flows globally?
There are a lot of members who would like to have a discussion of the green box, a reopening, if you will, of green box criteria. Some would argue that the green box has gone too far, and that a lot of the measures that now fall into the green box are not very green. So that's happening. That conversation is happening. But next to that conversation, there is another conversation that some are trying to initiate, and that's called the repurposing of agricultural subsidies. And that repurposing conversation goes, it basically argues that subsidies that damage the environment should not be tolerated. So like the fisheries agreement, we should take an approach to agricultural subsidies that is based on the environment and on sustainability criteria, and subsidies that harm the environment should slowly be removed and repurposed. But the problem lies in the word repurposing. And Brazil has just submitted a paper in the WTO arguing that repurposing might be a very bad idea. Shifting one BAT subsidy from one place to another place may not be a very good idea. Maybe we should just get rid of subsidies instead of having a repurposing of some sort be the goal. So that conversation is happening too. So we have to see where all of that lands. There are some interesting World Bank IFPRI reports that I can share with the organizers that comment on this repurposing discussion, that caution against the repurposing of harmful agricultural subsidies. But yes, there's a big discussion to be had around subsidies and sustainability. I agree.
And I do think it highlights the need for a broader approach to collaboration and cooperation on these issues, because the tools at the WTO are limited and only look at one part of the sustainable trade equation. That's where organizations like the FAO and others do play an important role, and sustainable trade in agriculture and food products could be one of these opportunities that we find new ways of working together to find more comprehensive solutions at the end of the day.
Agree. And right now there are two competing forces. One force is to expand the green box, and one is to limit the green box. And those who want to expand the green box want to repurpose BAT subsidies and expand the green box with those repurposed subsidies. And others who don't think this repurposing makes any sense and who don't like measures that are already sitting in the green box. So we have a tug of war here happening over the green box. And it's not an easy conversation to have, and it hasn't even started in earnest, I would say.
Has the rain stopped, Lloyd? Do you want to contribute to the conversation?
The rain is still going strong. But maybe there's one thing that I want to say before I just give up. The beautiful thing about the rain is water is life, and it helps. It helps us have the green hills and lawns and everything here in Costa Rica in order to grow that coffee that you guys need in Canada, John Charles. But I think there are many in Canada who might say beer is your national drink. not coffee, but we can have that debate later. But Noah, I'm not sure if you were there. I'm pretty sure Claire was there, but I think the inaugural speech at the public forum was a guy named Jason Furman, the former National Economic Council chair of the United States. And he did a great job of explaining how over the past 25 years, as trade has exploded, so has the well-being of human beings on planet Earth. The economies of the world have expanded fantastically. All the indicators of life have improved. All of it, part of it was because of this global trade phenomenon that has taken place because of the GATT and the worldwide around and what's now the WTO. And so he did a really good job kind of, despite all the anti-trade skeptics that are out there, he showed and he painted, I think, very nicely how trade has really improved the course of human history over just the last 25 years. Everything has gotten better. The problem is there's been a backlash, and a lot of that is because of special interests. Some of that is now because of sustainability, and we've all been discussing that, with the EU farm to fork and with the deforestation rights and other things that are coming to the fore. So I think there's opportunity here as well to figure out how we can work as a global family to ensure that we take care of our environment, but we also have the tools so that we can produce more sustainably and that we have a lesser impact on our environment. And one of the best things that I think Jason talked about is we all, nobody likes a trade deficit, but often imports are good for countries. They're good for the poorest people of those countries because it helps with price stabilization and the availability of foods and other resources that you wouldn't have. And as Dylan really mentioned, the food trade is globalized. It's a really manufacturing of food that happens around the world. And I think, we as a policy community need to do a better job of communicating that to policymakers first, but also to their constituents so that they understand that, just because a country has a trade deficit, for instance, the United States has a trade deficit right now, people are attacking, the Department of Agriculture or the Trade Service. Why don't we have a trade service? Well, it's because the economy is doing great and we're importing lots of good products from around the world. So I think we need to do a better job on trade education. That's not easy. But I think, really good conversations like the one Jason had at the WTO, that's a positive step. But he's speaking to the converted. How do you speak to the rest of the world about this? And that's something that we need to think about. And as a community, figure out how to do better. So I'll end with that. Still raining here in Costa Rica.
No, I think I agree. There's a lot of skepticism and misunderstanding, which I think causes some of that perception of the trade-offs, and it adds, I think, some of the tension that are already seeing in different spheres. Yeah.
I was interested by the figure that Valeria put up. Trade is about 20% of food security globally. That means 80% is domestic. But trade usually gets a bad rap in domestic discussions about food security.
Yeah.
Lots of trade literacy to do still. I'd like to go ahead, please, do it.
I just want to echo what one of the participants has put in the chat, Virginia McKinney, where she says that on the standards issue, outcomes or better, it's better to try to achieve outcomes through a carrot rather than a stick approach with trading partners. And she gives some examples in the chat, and I agree. I think that a lot of the developing world would say that what it needs is technical assistance, what it needs is financial assistance instead of essentially trade sanctions to comply with environmental standards. But also, on the deforestation issue and the EU regulation, what many developing countries have said is, if you are going to calculate the impact of land use change in our country, you need to look at, you need to take a more holistic look at what we're doing to lower our emissions. You can't just look at the issue of land use change in isolation as you judge our palm oil plantations, for example.
Mhm.
So, and so that, those are the tricky issues that, when a country wants to sort of establish itself as the arbiter of what is good or bad for the environment, then how it goes about doing that and whether it does that in a holistic way becomes an issue. I think we're going to have to see how this issue develops. But I think that the comment in the chat is very pertinent. I think that a carrot approach will certainly need to accompany the trade stick if that trade stick is to be used.
I was talking to many Canadian importers recently about sustainability, and they recognize it as important, but not as important as food safety. That is the number one criteria for being able to export and import anything anywhere, especially here.
Mhm.
If you're not certified, you're not coming into this country. That's it. End of discussion. And even then, sustainability isn't number two. It's reliability of supply. Can I get those 2 containers per week, please? I don't want 1 container for 6 months. And if you can't, then I'm going to go to another provider or supplier. And then after that, we can talk about quality of the product, the taste, the texture, the freshness, all those good things. And, all that regulatory stuff. Are your labels in English and French?
Mhm.
Are you reporting the food allergies? Sustainability comes after negotiating with price. Like it's way down the list for industry. Not that they don't recognize it as important, but it's not a priority given the other criteria that goes first.
It is important at the same time, JC, to acknowledge that even though it may be low down that trade and commercial relationship from a value chain or a private sector perspective, that is still far more likely the space that a farmer is going to run into sustainability in that international trade perspective today, because I think we are still quite far away from any kind of global regulatory framework that that can take and manage trade sustainability. But it can be an issue for retailers or different end users, buyers of the product, and that's probably having a greater impact on sustainability and trade from a food perspective today.
I think
Go ahead, Eva.
I think that there's nothing in WTO rules that would prevent a country from pursuing sustainability within the confines of its own territory. The reason why countries begin to address imports is because they want to address sustainability without losing competitiveness. And so they come under pressure from industry to say, well, the producers of an equivalent product abroad who are not subject to standards that are as high should somehow be punished. And that, that's where the problem lies. And I think that, countries that want to pursue sustainability need to have a serious conversation about whether they're willing to pay the price of that. If it hurts competitiveness, then so be it. How badly do you want sustainability? And that's the question that needs to be asked. Now, as soon as you start, trying to impose those same production standards on a trading partner, the issue gets complicated. And very often that's done not because of wanting the trading partner to become sustainable, but rather not wanting your sustainable producers to be outcompeted by an unsustainable producer elsewhere. And so the problem lies there. And so maybe there's another way to compensate producers who move towards sustainability goals domestically, through some sort of green subsidies, basically incentives, instead of punishing the incoming product.
Yeah, we have beneficial management practices here in Canada, and the farmers don't particularly get any subsidy or a thank you incentives. There are programs starting. The ecosystem services too were not recognized either, and they're hard to value. It's nascent. We are maybe 25 years behind food safety in terms of establishing a whole ecosystem, supporting sustainability. It's part and parcel of our future. we have no choice but to be smarter and more responsible. Yes. Most farmers that I've spoken to, at least the ones that I know, will tell me that they do it because they have to. If they don't have to, like if the environmental risk is not part of their business risk, they tend to wait before they will act on the investments necessary to adjust to the realities of climate change, for instance.
But I think, JC, it's also again important to acknowledge that even though that policy framework for sustainability may be 25 years behind where the food safety one is, it is still it is also further behind, I think, where production systems are today. Again, farmers in Canada switched to no-till cropping systems 30 years ago, not because it was good for environmental performance, but because it was good for them. I read this morning a Bloomberg article that referred to the challenge that life science, that crop protection product companies have because of the switch to much more responsible use of their products. That their business model is having to change because the new tools that farmers have around artificial intelligence and precision farming are reducing the amount of products that they're using on their farm, and that's having a commercial impact on those value chains and their business models. And so I think that is also, again, we can get very caught up in what does the global trading system mean and what should it do. We could talk about what does that domestic policy framework look like. But as all of that is happening, the reality on farms and in food systems is changing pretty rapidly as well.
I would like to invite the panel to speak and debate a little bit more. There are no more questions in the chat I can see. I would, if maybe 2-3 more minutes together and exchanging on reactions, commenting, feedback that you've heard so far. I would like to invite the audience, the attendees, to participate in the survey with us. Claire and I will run you through it over the next, it'll take probably 12 to 15 minutes, given the number of questions. And the surveys are available in English and Spanish. Please share the links with the community at large. We are looking for more participation, more results, to have a more representative and stronger report at the end. Any final comments from the 4 panelists?
Well, I'll just chime in. The rain has subsided a little bit. I want to thank you, JC, and Tyler, and Doa, and Claire, and Valeria for being a part of this, as well as for everyone that's listening. I think this is really where the world is moving. As I discussed at Claire's panel at the public forum, there wasn't enough room because everyone's interested in this, and it wasn't just Canadian farmers or policymakers. It was folks from around the world. There was great interest in this, and so we took this to the WTO ministerial last year, and now to the no, it wasn't last year. It was just earlier this year. So much happening, from 1 month and 1 week to another that you sometimes forget everything that's happening. But I again want to applaud the leadership by Cappy on this initiative, and then the Gifty organization as well. They are bringing the world together. We need to extend that, and I think working with the ICA, we can extend that into Latin America more, as well as to our colleagues in Africa and Asia. It's important that we have a global conversation. The place to have that conversation is really the WTO, because the WTO enables small countries to be at par with big countries as well, and to have a real important discussion. And I think that'll also maybe help reinforce the importance of the WTO. In many countries, in my own, it's sometimes for some reason has a bad name despite all the excitement when it was created. We need to really tell the story better about how important it has been for global trade. And so, Doa, we look to you for the ammo, and we'll do our part here to convey to policymakers, at least in our world, in the Ministry of Agriculture, why having a rules-based mechanism for trade is so important for us, not just for the value of the products we produce, but also the important food and good coffee and beer, tequila, whatever, from around the world. This is important for global food security. It's important for economic development of our farm sectors, and that applies to the multiple aspects of the food chain that you discussed very well. So thank you again to all of you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this in Canada and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you very much to you for having organized this very important dialogue. Sustainability is a topic that has just arrived on the agriculture negotiating table. It's a negotiating table that's already packed with very difficult issues, and sustainability now comes on top. But it is an issue that's absolutely critical, given the climate crisis and given the speed at which governments are implementing climate legislation of various sorts. So absolutely, we're going to have to work on the trade and sustainability nexus, and any ideas that you have are welcome, and seminars such as this one are fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you for contributing to the dialogue. On the contrary, I'm looking forward to strengthening those ties and continuing the discussions with ICA and WTO.
And again, I'd also like to add my thanks to the work that ICA is doing. I really do think someone referenced the carrot and the stick earlier. You know, the ability to approach trade and sustainability with carrots will get us so much more further at the end of the day than trying to improve outcomes through very restrictive measures or trade barriers. And really, it's about how do we build that community of support around the world that recognizes and acknowledges that agriculture has made significant progress on sustainability, but can still make more progress. But the way to achieve that is by collaboration, cooperation, facilitation, and enablement. And so look forward to continuing to see this. I do think that the results that come out of the survey can really help inform and encourage more thoughtful debate and dialogue going further. I know the context that we operate in Canada is very different than in other parts of the Americas, but I'm increasingly convinced that we have far more in common than we do have in difference, and the more we can work together, the better.
I agree. You might want to add the CAPI event in the chat so that people can register. And I saw Heidi ask in the chat if today's workshop will be available online. All of our workshops, about a week after the date of the workshops, become available on our YouTube channel and are published on our ICA Canada page. If you go to the ICA Canada website, there are country pages across our 34. You're welcome, Heidi. And so the H-Country office has its own webpage. So we've got ours with events and newsletters and partnerships and publications, blogs, all that kind of thing. It's all available on our webpage there. My thanks to the panel. Excellent discussions today. We've run out of time, but I'm glad it was an introductory way to introduce the survey, because this discussion is only at its beginnings, and we want to contribute through science, and we will be publishing a report over the fall at ICA Canada with the help of Claire here. Paulina, can you put up online the survey, please, in English and Spanish? I guess we can only do English, and then people can follow in the Spanish version. Right, so you've got the survey links on the chat. The panelists, if you want to participate, you're most welcome to fill in the survey. Alice, I know we're all busy, so feel free to move on to your next appointment. And I really thank you sincerely from the ICA Canada office here for your time and contributions today. So you will see it's a bilingual survey. If the attendees will look at the Zoom screen, you can open it up on your own. We will then take you through the questions up to about 15 minutes. The plan is to finish way before 1:30 Ottawa time. Over to you, Claire, maybe to introduce the survey concept.
I think overall the concept is to ask what should be the ideal state of sustainability and trade overall, and how to get there, and perhaps seek input from participants as to what they understand are some of the challenges and their experiences with respect to trade and sustainability issues in their own business and regions. I will say overall that is the concept.
Thanks. Melina, do you want to move on then so that we can accompany the attendees and the English is fine. So this is, like clearly this is stuff that you can fill on your end. Quite self-explanatory. If you scroll down, Paulina. Yeah, that's all. We can go to part one, question one. So we don't need to fill in that on our end. I just want to help the attendees fill in the survey. And then Claire can start with the agricultural sustainability questions.
Yeah, so essentially basic, what's the primary goal of a sustainable agriculture from your perspective?
So we won't read each of the answers. The idea is to guide you as you're filling it out. Claire and I are here available for the next 15 minutes. In the chat, if you've got an issue with one of the questions, you're looking for clarity. We're happy to help you understand the wording. You can see the second question, quite self-explanatory, and wanted your perspective on how trade affects ag sustainability.
Second question, how does international trade affect agricultural sustainability from your perspective? You've got multiple choice, and you can expand a bit in the last answer.
So part of that way forward that Claire was talking about in her presentation, that's in question 3. Like your coming years, I would say medium term, not next year, not short term.
How do you envision the evolution of agriculture trade in the coming years?
And we covered number 4 throughout the discussions this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you were. And there are regional tensions, there are geopolitical conflicts, it affects trade. We saw it in COVID, it was very, very clear. But also, let's say the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was quite clear. In terms of North Africa, Middle East, highly affected in terms of wheat and food insecurity, as Ukraine is so important in terms of not just wheat, but even I think it's sunflower oil and maize, and South America very concerned with the access to fertilizers and inputs from Belarus and Russia, since they import 85% of it. You heard Valeria's numbers. So it's a reality. Wanted your perspective on that. Question 5. So it's again looking forward, but over the next decade. So still medium term, 5 to 10 years, not short term. You want to take 6?
Sure. From your perspective, what challenges do you think have the greatest impact on global agriculture in balancing trade and sustainability? How will that particular intersection, that nexus,
Thanks. So we're in part 2, and we're going fast. It's just, I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm assuming you're doing well in terms of responding. Part 2, it starts with an open-ended answer. So that's 7 in terms of the changes at the WTO, ag negotiations, and other forums to make it more sustainable globally. You can use bullet form, full sentences, whatever you're comfortable with. Maybe give them 30 seconds to fill in that one. My thanks to the attendees for staying on at the end of 2 hours of workshops. and discussions and panelists and great discussions about trade and sustainability. Appreciate you staying on. We're almost done. We're halfway through, or even past that now. You want to take it?
What challenges will have the greatest impact on global agriculture's ability to balance trade and sustainability? Question is in your experience, do sustainability practices in agriculture have unintended consequences for trade?
Your answers will remain anonymous. We don't cite anyone in particular. The idea is to aggregate up the responses.
Mhm.
Number 10, and we were talking about it, and Doa mentioned it, in terms of the environment, on the degradation of ecosystems.
Mhm.
And the coffee rust in particular is a major issue. Right now, ICA is working on, say, fusarium and bananas. We have the global secretariat in South America, globally, out of our office in South America. It affects trade. So these are just some examples of plant health, but there are so many others. Wanted your opinion on that, please. Number 10. You want to take global coffee?
Yeah. On the topic of global cooperation, this is really looking at global international standard setting agencies and organizations like the WTO, but others as well. How can global cooperation better support coherent policies for sustainable agriculture? How can they avoid the fragmentation that was mentioned earlier?
In 12, the idea is it's about standards. So wanted to know how effective the global standards are in promoting sustainable ag trade. And if you're interested in global standards, there's a lot of good work out of the IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development. They have a division focusing only on this. We've done workshops for the Americas on sustainable agriculture standards. 13.
The next question is on how we can best support the 500 million family farms in the Americas region in transitioning to comply with agriculture standards and managing transition costs.
Yeah, I mean,
We
family
heard-
farming, they're all different sizes, and family farm,
They're all different sizes, all
Yeah.
different contexts, all different practices, all different
yes,
ecosystems.
as a sector as a whole.
Yeah.
What's your opinion here? How we can best support them? Part 4. So the focus is on WTO and global institutions. Even ICA plays a role in this. We support our member states on trade. And what should the WTO and other institutions play in promoting sustainable agriculture? This is an open-ended question again. Just bullets are fine.
Yeah.
Keywords, short sentences, anything that comes to mind.
The next section is on data and measuring outcomes. Which approach do you believe would be most effective in evaluating and promoting sustainable agriculture trade practices? I think here this is are we looking at outcome-based approach or a mix of practice-based approach?
appreciate your opinions on this. And you saw one of the slides that Tyler had shown on Canada's National Agriculture Environmental Index. Performance Index. Yeah, that's question 16. You can scroll up, probably down. You'll see it's about metrics and indicators that are most effective for evaluating the success of sustainable agriculture practices. In Canada, the government publishes every 5 years an environmental indicator series, and you can see over time the trends over the last 30 years. Every 5 years, you've got data since 81, and you can see how, given the goals, what you want is to be over 80 as optimal. And then sometimes they're at 65 or at 50 or but it's climbing or declining. So it gives you a sense of where to invest as a government in terms of policy decision making.
17, and I think it is the last question. How can data transparency and accessibility be improved to support sustainable agriculture?
Again, a data question. It's
data management, data
yeah.
sharing.
This could be a whole workshop on its own.
Yep. About transparency and building trust in the system.
And privacy and proprietary data and protection. The whole ecosystem is part of our future. My thanks to everyone, to all the attendees, to the interpreters in Costa Rica, to the panelists once again, to the team here at ICA Canada. I've learned a lot. A sincere thanks for filling in the survey. Please promote it. There are a couple of days left before we close the survey to feed into this report. And I'll ask my colleagues, Paulina and the team here, to share with the participants today when the report will come out. And a link to the presentation of today's workshop. Stay safe. Thanks for taking part. Enjoy your weekend and take care. Bye-bye now.